Welcome to Empowered Living. I'm Ann Chu. On this podcast, innovative leaders and visionary experts share insights and practical tools for work, family, and marriage. Each episode, we'll explore how to elevate your life while staying grounded in what truly matters to you. You're working hard to navigate relationships, build a thriving family, and create a legacy of purpose. We're here to help you do that with confidence and intentionality. So if you're ready to live a life by design, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Hey, Gary, it's so great to chat with you today.
You too, Ann. Good to see you.
Yeah, I'm so excited for the listeners to really get to dive into this work. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of having a family village. So many generations living on the same property. What do parents need to know right now that are raising their kids to raise kids that actually want to participate in this multi-generational living, this family village concept?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think it depends on the age of the child, number one. Because if they grow up, probably at the age of 3 or 4 in this environment, it's natural to them. So it wouldn't be something unusual because that's how they grew up. I grew up in a family of 10, and we were a 3-bedroom house with 1 bathroom. I've never had an issue with that whatsoever. So everywhere else I've ever gone in my life, it's been more space, more everything. So I think a lot of it is the formation of the child at whatever age that starts. So I would say if a child comes in at a later age, it could be disconcerting for them, especially if they were used to being only the attention of the parents to that child, not their attention being split by other family members now and again when they see each other. But I would say that if long as the environment is set up conducive to keeping those relationships strong, and then that child can pick up from other family relationships those things that really will help them develop into a better version of themselves. That's where I think that makes a big difference from that standpoint. And I believe just seeing my 7-year-old grandson on this property, he's getting the benefit of a 90-year-old down to his parents' age, in their late 30s. And he's getting the benefit of all those great-grandparents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles in different ways. And everybody has a different relationship with them. So you can't get that without traveling somewhere else all the time. So I think that makes a huge impact on him or any other child growing up when you have multiple families together. If it's done in a positive manner and people understand that this is what we're all supporting each other, that's what's going on here, then I think it's a very conducive, very strong environment for them.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, and what a lucky kid to get to grow up with that environment and that support around him. What have you seen it do for the family members' mental health, whether it's yours or like other family members? Like how and you talk a little bit about this in your book about the emotional bonds.
Yeah, yeah.
Talk to me about what you've seen from a mental health perspective.
There's something in life where you can't put your attention to something and you can't be intentional about something until you're first aware of something. And so what I notice, and my wife and I always, every day to day go around the property, our family village, and look at everyone. You'll notice right away when someone's off, whereas you normally wouldn't know that, right? So you'll go, hey, boy, so-and-so feels off today. And you can obviously address that, relatively speaking, for it. So if you think about that, a lot of times we just don't want to tell people we don't know we're feeling bad or whatever that happens to be, but others observe that in us, and as long as we're kind and have a great relationship with each other, we can make them aware of that. Hey, you seem off today. What's going on? And then let them, move forward, because that communication is very, very important for all human beings. That somebody notices something's not going right, for instance, and helping to support that wherever they can, or at least making that person feel needed because you're actually addressing them about that versus they're stuck by themselves in an apartment in New York City or something where no one can see this and they don't have anybody but close friends. They might see it at work and they might not. So this is where the environment can be very conducive to helping people during their tough times, or helping them know that they're not in a good way right now for whatever reason, or listening to them, or interacting with them. We have a lot of family dinners that just kind of pop up all the time. And so you get a lot more of that camaraderie, I want to call it, or closer family. And anytime you're together and people love each other, they're going to support each other. It's just what's going to happen.
Okay, so talk to me about the logistics. Is it actually under one roof for you guys? And what does the property look like if we were to come visit? What would we
Sure.
experience?
Yeah, so and I interviewed 20 families doing family estates or family villages, and so there as much as there was one family that has four condos connected in a building, which is really tight if you think about space, right? 10,000 acre ranch where people can be some distance from each other, up to half a mile or a mile away. Our particular environment, each home is about a couple hundred feet away from each other. So it's far enough away that there's some distance. So if there's something going on, you don't know about it. Somebody's screaming or yelling or whatever, But it's close enough where you can be there in a minute or two, so it's easy to move around. And that's, I think, is really good because it helps people have their private space when they want their private space and helps them to come out into the public areas, so forth. And we have several gathering areas. We have our beach where we gather at. We have this main home where my wife and I are in, this real large, so we have a gathering space. But we'll also have meals in the other spaces based on somebody says, hey, I just want to make a chili tonight. Everybody want to come over? They'll text the whole family. We go, yeah, sure, we'll come over. What time? Boom, and we'll go over there. Stuff like that happens because you can easily do that because it's right there. It's not, like a mile away. You got to get in a car, drive, or whatever. So it makes it simple to move, but far enough away keeps your privacy. That's how ours works anyway.
This is fascinating to me because my sister-in-law and I always joke about having a family compound and having this, multiple houses on one piece of property and being really close to each other. So it's really interesting to me. For you guys, did you purchase the property and then you started building your home first and then other people joined in, or did everybody decide together we were going to do this and we're going to
That
move on to the property at the same
that
time?
that's a really good question. It's actually the question that comes up for anybody trying to do this. And what I've found, at least for people trying to do this, and it's not been many, but enough, is it usually starts with two family members. It starts with two, generally. Now, it could certainly start with more, but two decide we might want to do this together, right? And then it gets into, well, where are we going to live? What's it going to be like? And everything else. So you get into this whole list of what I call non-negotiables and negotiables. In other words, we had 6 non-negotiables and about 20 negotiables. And we made sure that the property had to have those 6. If it didn't have those 6, we weren't buying it, which makes it really much simpler, believe it or not, to find the right property. In our case, we wanted the property to already have the buildings in place. We would build something if necessary, but we didn't have to, as it turned out. And we looked for 4 years. We were very, very slow in this process, but we were trying to figure this whole thing out. Really, there's no one out there that can really understand this or has put it down in any form for us to understand. So we were trying to find our way through this. But we ended up in this property, which had 5 separate homes, basically, just the way it was designed over time by the previous owner, because he had his children here, and what he did was he built another house for a child. Then when they became adults and got married, and so they kind of happened. That's how it ended up structurally here. Plus, he had a little property, nice little cottage on the pond, the swimming pond. So that made it separate property as well. So it had everything we needed. It had all our non-negotiables, and it had many, many of our negotiables. So we were able to come in here knowing that we had most of everything we wanted and it was going to fit our family.
What were your 6 non-negotiables?
So they fell in the area of the property itself had to have over 20 acres. They had to have both fields and forests. They had to have water, at least one water feature, as an example. It had to have clean air, clean water, no noise pollution, no air pollution, and there were some other ones. But basically, we had to make sure that it had those items. And believe it or not, 95% of the properties don't fit for a variety of reasons. And we didn't have a lot of non-negotiables, but there were enough where it wouldn't fit because of one of those factors not being there.
Yeah. So I'm so curious, the person that you bought the property from, it sounds like he was doing this, he was living this idea of a family village. What changed for him? Like what went wrong? How come they decided all of a sudden to not do it anymore?
I think he wasn't looking at a family village. He was just said, well, I've got a land and my children are not ready to go out on their own. They don't have enough money. So I've got a building. He just repurposes buildings. Basically, you guys, you want, you can fix that space. And it basically happened with 2 parts of the property. And they said, sure, they got married. And in fact, the one is about half a mile that way and the other one's like a quarter mile that way. So he broke off land. Once they were ready to move out on their own and build their own properties, he broke off land for them. So they were separate. So yeah, he kind of had his own little family village, but it wasn't, I think it just came out of, as they got married, he said, hey, would you like to do this? And not everybody did. He had 5 kids, so 2 of them did it out of the 5. So it wasn't like they all did that. It's just the way it worked out over time, over about a 20-year time span.
Yeah. So, what would you tell people who, like, for example, my husband and my mom get along. They love each other, they respect each other. My mom lives with us, and it's been really incredible for my kids to grow up with her under the same roof. It's something that I know they're going to remember for the rest of their lives. But I think sometimes in-laws get a bad rap. And so what would you tell people that kind of have this dream of having a family village but are having issues with their in-laws? How do you work through some of that conflict to
Yes.
do this family village concept in a healthy, productive way?
So one thing now, for 35 years before this happened, I've been working with families and helping them plan estate planning multi-generationally and helping them through these various things. So I've seen quite a bit of this. And one of the things I learned was the founding family, in my case, me and my wife, they have a hard time letting go of a variety of things. And make it real basic, and this is tough for people to hear, is you move into a servant role. You move into a role where, and it's a benevolent servant, however you want to look at it, but you're no longer the person in charge. You're now trying to be, I'm the mayor of this little family village. But as the mayor of this village, I don't use my authority at all on anything. I'm here just to make sure people are getting along, the resources are here for everybody, the finances work out, anything somebody wants to pursue. One of our primary, by the way, the number one non-negotiable for us was that anybody coming on this property would be able to do anything they wanted. They were born to do, the gifts that were given to them on this property. So we had to have the ability to support them, money, everything else. That's a tall order when you think about it. That's why the property had to be so unique for us, because it had to have the ability to allow somebody to be who they are and for us to all support them. And so when you look at our property, and getting through this in a way is like, I'm into the forests and the trees. My wife's into all the water features. My daughter's into all the land and farming, and my son-in-law is into all the infrastructure and everything else. Just giving you an idea.
Yeah.
Now, all of us have to support each other relative to that. Now, when you do that, there's less conflict. Generally, they're still going to have conflict. That's just the nature of the beast. But when things come up and people are acting out or there's something happening, my perspective is we support them no matter what they do. Now, they can't be doing something that's going to harm anybody or anything else. But that attitude is something I don't see people recognizing up front to do. It's like, you may have the money, but you do not use that at all against anybody else. And remember, money and people, that happens every day. People use money to control family members, control it, but I see it all the time. So it's a horrible thing. It's just what happens, unfortunately. So having seen that, I said that cannot happen. We have to be moved into a role where we're supporting everybody here. We have obviously the financial largesse to do that, but we're not going to use that whatsoever. That makes a difference when you're dealing with your in-laws, because you're not coming in saying, hey, my rules, my home, my blah, blah, blah kind of thing. You're coming in as, hey, we're all going to go with some rules, but guess what? I'm no different than you. Just because I have the money, that doesn't mean I'm in any different player. I think that helps. Can't say that that's going to do everything, but it does send a message to everybody, is that they can be who they want to be, and this property and this family is about everyone, not about any particular person, and it will have to be that way into the future. And we talk about this in the book about seventh generational philosophy, where the Iroquois Indian tribes did that. They looked out 7 generations and said, what we do today, how will it affect the 7th generation? Why the 7th generation? Because no one will ever know them. And so it takes all the agenda off the table. So I think you have to start where you take everybody's agenda off the table. At least I can take mine and my wife can take hers. So we can set the example, set the leadership for that. That will go a long way to helping resolve issues and conflicts and so forth, in my view.
Yeah. So you mentioned it briefly, but I'd like to dive in a little bit more about how you've seen families split finances
Mm,
are living in a family village. Like,
sure.
for what? How do you come to that agreement? Because money is such a touchy subject for families. And
Yep.
so how do you navigate it in a way where people don't become resentful about it?
Interesting point. Aristotle had a thing called distributive an idea of justice. And distributive justice is that basically you look at each person to see what they can do. And that's what you really provide. You look to the standard for them. Because different family members are going to have different money standards. There's no way to make it fair, equal to everybody. There's going to have to be a fairness level. So the distributive justice says, okay, we have a workshop where we walk families through this. There's three possible ways that I've seen through all the research I did and the interviews I did. Three ways that we see this happen. First is the founding family funds everything. Not the best approach, because you can end up with a lot of entitlement and everything else by doing that, because nobody has any skin in the game except for the family supporting it. But that happens. One founding family does it. Second is everybody puts in the same amount equally, or to the distributive justice amount that it can do for that property. Or third, it's a combination of the founding family and the other families. And that's usually what you see most of the time. At least all the ones I've seen, there's only been 10 or 15 or 20% that do equally across the board. Most of them are going to be a combination of the two. And again, if you think through that, it makes a lot of sense, because you can't, if you have to go buy your own property or your own land and everything else and support all of that, you can't get much if your income is limited. But if you have your income with everybody else added together, you can get much more of the amenities and everything else in the process of being able to do that. So one of those three ways will work out for families. They have to figure out which one works.
So where do you see, what are the pitfalls that you see with this distributive justice?
People don't buy into it. They have it's probably one of the most difficult things with money that takes a long time for people to learn. Number one, in our society, which is strange, we're a very heavily capitalistic society the way we operate in this country. You would think we'd be really good with money, but as it turns out, we're very poor with money. And the main reason is it's just not taught. We will teach our child how to walk. We'll teach them how to talk. We'll teach them how to tie their shoes. We teach them how to dress. We teach them everything. But as soon as it comes to money, we don't. It's like, oh, you can't talk about that. It's too private. In fact, this is a statistic that'll kind of blow your mind. The number one taboo in our country is money. It is twice as unlikely, two times as unlikely for you to talk about money than you talk about your sexual orientation, your political orientation, and taking drugs and being a drug addict or alcoholic. Twice as much. Not like, so people are more apt to talk about those things, which you think would be rather private, right? Than they will be to talk about money. So when you look at that, we're starting, I don't care what age it is, if you're 20, 30, 40, 50, you're starting with a very, very limited education about money. And again, people will take offense to this. Think, well, wait a minute, I've been making money my whole life, I'm great at it, but what's your behavioral relationship with money? You're taught all these other things as a child behaviorally. When a child is screaming, yelling, and terrible tantrums at 2, you slowly teach them that that's not how they react in society. They have to learn to control their emotions. It comes to money, we don't ever talk about that. We don't talk about how to control that. So you have people doing crazy things with money. It's just all over the place. So it takes a while first to go, yeah, I'm one of them. I was. Yeah. And then saying, okay, do I want to still be like that? That's like trying to lose weight or exercise. It's not easy, because you've been doing this the whole along. So it's tough to change. It took me a while. It took me at least a decade to get my act together relative to that. But I watched so many others go through it that I said, I'm not going to be like that. And I don't want to teach my children that. I want them to have a really good relationship with money, because then we won't have that issue. But I got to tell you, you'll have people that say, absolutely, everybody has to do this. Or just, they'll make these really absolutes about money, which are not true whatsoever, but they're true for them. And because that's how they feel about it. So yeah, it can be a really contentious area for sure.
Okay, so how can families avoid that conflict? What rules, what expectations, what boundaries do you think that they need to be talking through, setting before they enter into a family village?
That's a great question. The very first stage to make sure you have a really strong foundation for a family village is about really four areas. Trust and communication, because we have to trust each other and we have to be able to communicate. We have to be able to listen well, not, what I mean by listening, but seeing the body language and everything else. And once I can trust and communicate, then I have to address conflict resolution because conflicts will arise. And how do you address conflict resolution? Going through to resolve these conflicts, which invariably will come up on that. And then after that, you get into basically your governance. And the governance is the rules. We say, okay, we can now trust each other. We know how to resolve conflicts. So now let's go ahead and put some rules together relative to how we're going to live in this family village. Now, if you think about it, a nuclear family of four, you probably have, well, your mom's there, so no, you have more than a nuclear family, but most people have a nuclear family of 4 or 5 or 3 or whatever it happens to be. Kind of everybody knows the rules after a while because mom and dad lay down the law, with the kids. They all learn the rules. Mom and dad agreed on them. They're not written down necessarily, though some people do, right? But it's kind of built into the fabric of the family. Well, your 4-person family has theirs, and this 4-person and that 4-person, and now you put them all together, it's a mess because we don't have any common rules here. And so that is the biggest issue is trust first, communication, knowing how to do conflict resolution, and then setting up the rules. Guys, here's how we're living on this family village. We got to all agree to these standard things. Otherwise, there's going to be more and more conflict resolution going on because we don't agree with how we do things.
What does not work in a family village?
What does not work? I think anytime anyone is not dealing fairly with other people or, it seems that they're not taking their load, like any family. Why do you teach your kids to take out the garbage and wash the dishes and everything else? And when they start picking back, I do that. Mom does that. We all have chores we have to do. This is part of who we are as a family living here. You have these chores and they may not agree with it, but then the kids go, okay, I get it. Yeah, I guess I've got to also do these kinds of things. So I think that, using some basic stuff here, but basically I think that's what happens is ultimately you just have to set up and say, here's how we all pitch in our unique way of what we do. And like I said, my wife does all the ponds and everything. She keeps all the waterways clean. That's her thing. So, that's what she does relative to this family village that we have. Everybody does their different things, so we want them to kind of match up if we can. What they love doing, but they're also doing as part of their overall equality of everyone here on the property.
Have you ever met a family and thought, oh, you guys should not be living in a family village? Like this?
Yes, many families.
What are those signs? What should people look
Well,
for?
my family, my siblings, if I were to sit here and going, I can think if I had 2 or 3 of my siblings here, it would be a nightmare.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that they're great with themselves,
Yeah.
but if we were to try to get together, it would be really difficult. And I know that, and they know that. It's just when you're not being honest with yourself relative to that. And we've got my wife's family here, so it's her sisters, her father, and my daughter and my grandson. So it's all kind of on my wife's side here. And they've always been a very tight family and they get along with each other really well. Not that my family doesn't, but my family can get pretty obnoxious.
Okay, so what advice do you have for people that find themselves unintentionally living in a family village? Meaning, like, for example, my mom's house was hit by the tornado and that evening she moved in with us. I have some friends who one parent passed away, and then after that happened, the other parent moved in with them. So for these families that are navigating an unexpected family village situation, what's your advice to them?
That's a great question. I think my guess is, because I haven't had that happen, and I don't recall any of those I've interviewed had that situation, although different family members came in for different reasons at different times, like someone died or whatever, so there was that kind of thing. But I mean, first you have to address that issue. If a tornado took your house out, there's got to be some real grieving going on there. There's got to be a time period where they've got to get through that whole process of losing everything they own, and having to move in. So in my view, if someone came on our property like that, we'd be doing a lot of support up front, I would say, because recognizing they need to first, I find people need to be first addressed where they are. And, when I have a client call and they're really frightened about something that's going on and they think their money's going to go away and everything, and it sounds to anybody on the outside, this doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't matter. This is where they are. And you address that saying, hey, okay, you can't understand them. You can't say that. So what you're saying is, here's what's bothering you right now. Is that right? So you're saying this, right? Okay. So how would you like us to help you? Or what do you think you need for support? What can we do to make sure where you're going is going to be better for you? And, I'm not a psychologist by any means, but I do know you have to address where somebody's at first and acknowledge that what they're feeling is true, their feelings. And at some point, hopefully they transition and get through that bad time to where they need to go. And what's nice is, me communicating, they might get something out of it. My wife, they'll get more because she's better than me. And, my sister-in-law, again, they'll get more. My father-in-law, they'll get more. That's what's nice, because when you have multiple people who are all supporting somebody coming in, they can really be heard and they can really be understood at multiple levels versus just one family member or two. And if everybody's trying to live in the family village that way, that's really helpful for anybody coming in because they get multiple relationships. And that's the plus side. The negative side is can have more conflict. The positive side is you have more support.
Right, right. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about your work as a financial planner, wealth advisor. Tell me, what is the number one mistake that you see parents making when they are thinking about how to pass their wealth on, when to pass their wealth on to the next generation?
There's this thing out there, and people really dislike it very much. And I'll name names only because people know about it. But Warren Buffett has said, and so has Microsoft. Bill Gates have both said that they're basically giving very little to their children. And they have their reasons, which is fine. But I think a lot of times when you hear that, it sounds like, oh, don't give your children money because that'll ruin them. It's kind of how it comes across from that. And I think it's one of the worst messages to send to people. So, I don't know, Ann, are you
3 kids, yep.
Okay, I guess to make sure I knew. All right.
Although 6, 4, and
Yeah, and I think you heard me say this when I was doing my 10-minute talk. I said, is there anybody out there, any parent, loving parent, that doesn't want their children to be better off than them? Is that a true statement? Would you agree? Okay. So if that's a true statement, that covers everything, right? I mean, the jobs they get, the people they marry, the children, the grandchildren they'll have, your grandchildren, on and on and on, the money that they will receive. If my children are better off than me and are making better decisions than me, why would I not want to give them the money to make better decisions with money than I can even do myself? Why would I take my money and give it to a third party who I don't know how they'll deal with that money? It doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense if you accept you think it's fact that your children are going to be awful with money, so don't ruin their lives. In the book I wrote, Multi-Generational Living, that was a story I told. I was driving home in 1991, and I had a bad feeling in my stomach after I had just put together an estate plan for a couple, and I met their children for the first time. And their children were my age. And I said, this money is going to destroy them. They knew nothing about money. And I just got involved what I thought was a future crime of giving them an additional $1 million or $2 million than they would have gotten, to Warren Buffett's point, and would make their lives worse because they would have all this money and it would destroy them. I wanted to go back to the office and tear up the documents because I felt so visibly moved. I just viscerally moved. I could not stand that. So I decided then, it's 30-something years ago, that I'm going to try to help these families learn about money over a decade or two so they're better off than their parents. And by the way, that particular family and several others, their parents have passed. They do have the money, and they're doing extremely well, better than their parents were doing, because we had time to help them really evolve and become better with their money and better than their parents were with money over time in training, or however you want to look at it. And there's just some basic ways to do that. So I think the number one mistake is people just accept that the money is going to possibly ruin their children, and they do things based on that, which I think is a really poor way of doing it.
So what is the alternative? How do you, because I hear all the time from our clients, we want to be able to enjoy the luxuries of life, the things that we have worked really hard for, but how do we balance that with not overexposing our kids to all these luxuries to the point where they become spoiled and bratty?
Yeah, good question. And it happened to us about 25 years ago because we bought a really expensive home relative to the area we lived. It wasn't that expensive, but it was in the area. And our children, of course, were going to school. And my daughter came home one day and said, Dad, are we rich? Because one of her classmates made a comment about how we must be rich because she's living in a big house, blah, blah, blah. And again, I had a conversation. I doubt she learned anything at 8 years old because you never know what when you're talking to an 8-year-old. But basically, I said, well, we have a nice house and we have all the stuff. I said, but rich is just something in someone's mind, how you define what that is. I walked her through all of that in a way. And I said, you see your mom and your dad, and we're out here working hard. We had horses, a horse farm. And I said, we don't hire people because we feel like we want to have something done with that, although we could. And I walked her through a lot of things that we were doing. And I said, so that's not what most people would call rich. They use that term to mean well-to-do and everything's provided for you and you got maids and servants and nice cars and everything's taken care of. I go, I find that most people like us don't do that. And I have nothing against anybody who does do that. I said, but it's not who you are and your character. And again, if the money changes you to then become that, that's a problem, I think, for the children because now they're looking to see how you're allowing the wealth to change who you are. So my wife and I didn't change who we fundamentally were with that. I'm out here doing a lot of heavy manual labor. My wife is too. Some people would say that's crazy. You have this money. Why are you doing that? Well, because I haven't changed who I am as a person. And actually, I'm out there and my grandson's seeing me and my daughter, everybody else. I'm not saying anything. I don't have to say anything. They know that. There's a story in the Bible, you may have heard this, Anne, I don't know, about St. Francis. I always find it's a great story. St. Francis, patron saint of all the animals and everything. He goes to one of the priests, hey, let's go out for a walk and preach in town. Oh, okay, let's go. They leave, they go out, they walk around, they don't say a word, and they walk around the circle around the town that they're in, and then come all the way back to their rectory, and the young priest says, well, St. Francis, when were you going to preach? He goes, we just did. And that's the point. I think we forget that most people look at our actions, not what we say. That defines who we are. So now I'm not doing it because of that. I'm just being who I've always been. So when someone says, oh, you're rich, they go, but a rich man doesn't do that. I said, well, define to me what a rich man is, because you apparently have a different definition of a rich man than I do. A rich man just means I have a lot of money. It doesn't mean it changes who I am. And if it does, you might question yourself, what's going on? Now, would you upgrade and be on a flight in first class? Sure you would. I'm not saying you don't do those kinds of things. That's not my point. The point is, as long as it doesn't change fundamentally who you are, then you're not defined by what people think rich means for the general public.
So what advice do you have for families who are, for the first generation, experiencing wealth?
That they basically go through that first four steps I talked about: trust, communication, conflict resolution, and governance, because that is foundational. And I call it that stage, I call it the foundation stage. Because if you don't get that right, it's just going to fall apart, If, hopefully you have a great relationship with your mom, she's living with you. But boy, if you guys don't trust each other, you're not communicating well, I can tell you right away, it's not going to work. She's going to leave. Or you're going to leave. One of the two, but, because it's too much, there's too much conflict, there's too much stress going on. And so it's really, really important to get that down really, really well. I have a partner. That's all he does is goes through the stages of that, up to 8 or 10 days of that with families, because it takes that long. You remember, if you're going from a 4-person family, there's 6 relationships in total. To a 12, if you had 3, 4-person families together, there's just 66 relationships. So if you go from 6 to 66, you're bound to have conflicts and issues. It's just going to happen. So if you don't get through these things, then you can't be proactive anywhere. You can't have deal with money, can't deal with the property, can't deal with, events, living together. I mean, everything falls apart. It's very important for that foundational part of it be done correctly.
So does your partner come on site and work with families?
Yeah, so he does either on site or also through Zoom, because we do a very short 2 hour version of that just to give people a taste. Because the workshop is a 2 day workshop, but it's meant to give them enough to know, okay, we need to do these things to make this successfully happen. And I just went through and said, if I was doing this over again, if I knew these things, I would be able to do this not in 4 years. I would have been able to do it in 3 months or 6 months. And it would have been a lot cleaner, and I would have had a lot less uh, issues dealing with. I was just basically going through this based on who I knew had done this or with families I've worked with and seeing the issues they had. But this is all new to me. And I wish I had had somebody around at that point to help me through that process.
Tell us about your book.
So, multi-generational living, which we'll call that Family Village, now that I have this new name. I'll give credit to Evan Carmichael. You and I both know him through Genius Network. So Evan, after my 10-minute talk, said, I don't like that word salad. And I said, yeah, I don't either, but I haven't found a better word, way. He goes, how about family village? How about we do that? And I played with it for a while. I said, I like that. It makes sense. It's about family, number one, and it is a little village you're dealing with. It just makes a ton of sense. But multi-generational living is basically going through these 4 stages, saying, hey, you have this foundational one, which I talked about, and then you're dealing with the structure part of it, which you already mentioned, one of them. You got to get your finances straight. Well, how are we going to do this? Am I funding it? Are we all funding it? Are we combined funding it? I mean, that got to figure out the property, the operating expenses. This is where people go way wrong. They buy too big of a place, too much, and they can't deal with it. They end up years later having to sell because they're just going financially bankrupt because they can't support the property. But also, there's estate stuff, there's how we're going to communicate, there's looking at your whole mindset about that structurally, and it sounds funny, the philosophy I talked about, how you go about, everything you do in that part. Then the third part is the transaction, and the transaction stage can be extremely stressful because you're going through and trying to find this property, and these properties are monsters because they're so much more complicated than a single family home, for a variety of reasons. You don't want to go through it, but there are 10 times as many obstacles to overcome in the process of getting these things done and completed. And once the property is completed, then you're going into that final stage, which is really, I mean, you're just kind of redoing everything, how you operate. It becomes transformational, basically, because you don't have any institutional knowledge of how it used to be living together as families, units that did close to 150 years ago. The reason we live the way that we do as nuclear families in the U.S. was purely logistics, as I've done the research. What happened was the family farms were shutting down with industrialization. They couldn't support themselves, so they had to move to the cities for jobs. So here you got 12 people from a family or 15 coming to the city. Now, whoa, you guys got to separate. You can't all live in the same apartment. You've got to be in different ones. You cannot live together. Believe it or not, that's where it started. It just started because the fact that it couldn't put these farm families or other rural families, even these different kinds of suburban families, even bringing into the cities, there was nowhere to house them easily, so they had to be separated into family groups. Kind of how we ended up where we are.
Okay, so if people want to learn more, how can they get a hold of you? How can they get in contact with you? How do they learn more about the workshops?
Sure. So it's Gary at multigen.com. Multigen.com is where they can go in and look at everything. And on there, there's a so multigen.com. And there's a place they can put their contact information in. They can certainly call my office number through my company, which is 847-441-5644. And that's probably the 2 easiest ways to do that. And if they want to learn more about how this whole thing works, then yeah, they can purchase my book. I've got it on audio as well, so they can, if they want to do it that way, or they can read it on on Kindle or just get the book itself.
Well, this conversation has inspired me to be a little more assertive and take some action on my future family village. I'm going to go call my sister-in-law and tell her I've got some new information that we're going to talk through. So I'm excited, and I really enjoyed chatting with you today. Thank you so much for sharing this.
Thank you, Anne. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to Empowered Living. I hope today's conversation sparked some inspiration and gave you tools to live more intentionally in your family, work, and life. If you enjoyed our episode today, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an inspiring story or actionable takeaway. And if you know someone who would love this episode, share it with them, because living an intentional life is better when we do it together. Until next time, remember, the life you want doesn't happen by chance. It happens by choice. Let's keep creating it one step at a time.